It's always a pleasure to introduce speakers and to meet you here at these symposia. I've been doing it for a decade, and I've enjoyed each and every event that we've had. I always feel so honored to introduce to you the extraordinary men and women we have brought to our community thanks to the Taubman Foundation. And of course, today's speaker, Michael Oren, is no exception. Michael Oren completed his undergraduate training and a master's degree in international affairs at Columbia University. And then he went on for a second master's degree and his doctoral degree in the history of the Middle East at Princeton University. He has been a visiting professor at both Harvard and Yale universities. He immigrated to Israel in 1979. He served as a paratrooper in the Lebanon War of 1982 and was a major in the Israeli Defense Forces in the reserve during the Israel-Lebanon War of 2006. He served as the director of Israel's Department of Interreligious Affairs in the government of the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, and as an Israeli liaison officer to the United States Sixth Fleet during the Gulf War. He is currently senior fellow at the Shalem Institute in Jerusalem, where he contributes to the Institute's quarterly journal, which I really recommend that you look at their website. Many of the articles for their journal, Azure, are translated. His editorials and articles have appeared in the Boston Globe, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the New Republic. There is much more than that we could say about the sorts of things that Dr. Oren does and has done in his career, but let's turn to his scholarship. Oren's 6 Days of War, June 1967, and the Making of the Modern Middle East, was published by Oxford University in 2002 and is arguably the best scholarly work written on the 6-Day War. He writes in his foreword to that book that he intended to, quote, recreate the Middle East of the 1960s, and I love this, to animate the extraordinary personalities that fashioned it and to relive a period of history that profoundly impacts us, end quote. There are very few books written about anything in the Middle East that reach the heights of Oren's writing. It is both elegant and the sheer power of his narrative abilities as a writer is just extraordinary. Indeed, it is thus not surprising that it should have received the praise it has. It received the Los Angeles Times' Award for History Book of the Year and also the National Jewish Book Award. The narrative quality of this book, Oren's attention to detail, and how he allows us to hear the voices of the past and the present, tempt me to liken his writing to the great work of James Agee and his extraordinary study of the American Depression and the Dust Bowl farmers in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. He is also the editor with David and Yoram Hazony of another book entitled New Essays on Zionism, which was published in 2006. And he also contributes to that volume 2 essays, one on Ord Wingate and the second on David Ben-Gurion's understanding of power. This, I believe, is a very important collection of essays by young scholars on Zionism, and it describes how these new Zionist thinkers emerged in the 1990s and how they hope in their scholarship to deepen our appreciation and our understanding of Zionism and the Jewish state. However, it is his Power, Faith, and Fantasy, America and the Middle East, 1776 to the present, published this past January, which brings us together this afternoon. This is an extraordinary book, and we have it for your purchase afterward, out there in the lobby, along with his 6 Days of War. This is an extraordinary book which uncovers the deep connections between us as Americans and the Middle East. He tells us, among so many other tales, And it was hard to pick one out to give you just an illustration of why you should buy this book and why it's so important. He tells us the story, very briefly, which I've been fascinated with for 40 years, about Herman Melville's mid-19th century visit to Palestine and the American Agricultural Mission, where among its members were the Gross-Steinbeck brothers. In 1858, after Melville had sojourned in the agricultural commune, a party of 5 Arabs attacked the farm. Johann Gross-Steinbeck left the mission and came to America, where he shortened his name to John Steinbeck. Well, that was his grandfather. Of course, that grandson, John, would transplant the biblical landscape to our Central Valley in his East of Eden. There's so much more that make Michael Oren an important person to listen to about our long connection to the Middle East. I'm absolutely excited and joyful to be able to listen to you, Michael. Let's welcome Michael Oren.
Careful. Thank you, Professor Heck, for that very warm and flattering introduction. I especially like the part about being a young scholar. That was the best. Thank you, Leonard Wallach. Thank you, the Taubman Foundation. Good afternoon, everybody. A great pleasure to be here. Great surprise to be the most overdressed person in Santa Barbara. Thank you. Okay. Begin today with a flight of imagination. Not on my part, on your part. Sit back, imagine. Imagine that every one of you is a high-ranking American diplomat who has been assigned by the U.S. government to undertake a very sensitive negotiation with a representative of a Middle Eastern government that has declared war against the United States. And you depart, you go to some undisclosed location in Europe, and you meet this Middle Eastern emissary, and you say to him that America does not want war with his country. Americans want peace with all nations of the Middle East, including the nations represented by this emissary. Americans merely want to conduct their trade freely in the Middle East without fear of attack and plundering. So imagine you've made your case to this Middle Eastern representative, and he turns to you and says, "No, we want war. We have a book," he says, "a holy book, we call it the Quran, and it tells us that we must wage a holy war against all infidel states. America is an infidel state, therefore we must attack you and we must enslave you. And our holy book further tells us that if any of our soldiers are killed in the process of conducting this campaign, then they will alight immediately to paradise." Well, having listened to the response of this Middle Eastern emissary, what then is your recommendation to the United States government? Well, if your recommendation is that America has no choice but to defend itself from this Middle Eastern threat, America has no option but to go to war in the Middle East, if that's your recommendation, then it would have echoed the recommendation of the first high-ranking American diplomat to be sent by his government on precisely such a mission, and his name was Thomas Jefferson. And the month was March, the year was 1785, and Jefferson was sent by the Congress first to London, then to Paris, to negotiate with a gentleman named Abdul Rahman an-Najjar, who was the emissary of the Pasha of Tripoli in what is today Libya, one of the 4 so-called Barbary states, along with Tunis, what is today Tunisia, Algiers in contemporary Algeria, and Morocco. The Barbary states, and America's relationship with the Barbary states was very complicated. It wasn't always about controversy. It wasn't always about war. Morocco claimed to be the first independent country in the world to recognize America's independence in December 1777. If you look at the second treaty ever signed by an independent United States after the Franco-American Treaty was the treaty signed with Morocco, and it bears the signatures of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and an inscription in Arabic with the Hijra date on it, America's second treaty. But by 1783, the Barbary states, which were pirate states, were sending pirate vessels out into the Mediterranean to prey on American merchant ships, and they were plundering their cargoes, they were enslaving their crews, And they're posing a mortal threat to the nascent United States. America, a seafaring nation heavily dependent on its foreign trade, with a huge war debt from the War of Independence, America was heavily dependent on that Mediterranean trade, which represented 20% of all of its foreign commerce. And the Barbary threats, by threatening that 20%, threatened to collapse America's very, very fragile economy. But that was only the beginning of the bad news. The bad news beyond that was America had no means of defending its commerce abroad. America had managed to emerge from the Revolutionary War without a single warship intact. They were all sunk or captured or sold off. And the really bad news was that America had no means of creating a navy. Remember, American History 101, in 1780s, America doesn't have a constitution yet. The 13 states are loosely confederated under the Articles of Confederation. There's no central government. There's no means of raising taxes to create a navy. So American merchant ships in the Mediterranean are literally defenseless in the water. And in the face of this mortal threat, a great number of Americans believe that the United States should emulate the practice of the Europeans, which was to pay off the pirates. They called it, rather euphemistically, paying tribute to the pirates. And they figured, why get involved in creating a navy? It's cheaper to pay off the pirates. And during the presidency of John Adams, the federal government is paying about 1/5 of all of its federal revenues to bribes to Barbary pirates. They're literally breaking the treasury. Among all of America's leaders, there's really only one individual who stands up and says, no, America should go to war, and that's Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson believed that the American people had a temper which was different than the European temper. That is, the Americans would not abide by being blackmailed. He believed that the more you paid off the Barbary pirates, the more piracy you'd get in return. And they believed that the Barbary pirates, not being democratic, would never honor a treaty beyond the reign of any given ruler. The next ruler would come along and violate that treaty. And Jefferson believed that even though it would cost more to build a navy to fight the pirates, America was better off going to war in the Middle East. But the majority of Americans disagreed. They were afraid. They feared getting bogged down in a war in this distant Middle East, a war that was open-ended and potentially very bloody. Today, more than 220 years later, Americans are grappling with some of the same dilemmas with the relationship with the Middle East. Should America try to negotiate with its adversaries in this area? Should it try to conciliate and pacify them? Or should it confront them and perhaps even crush them? Today, I would reckon that many Americans would be surprised to hear that not only Thomas Jefferson, but Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln had important Middle Eastern policies. They'd probably be surprised to hear that one of the individuals implicated in the assassination plot against Lincoln managed to escape to and was arrested in Egypt, or that during the Civil War, 500 Egyptian soldiers fought on North American soil. They would, I imagine, be very surprised to hear that the original lyrics to the Star-Spangled Banner spoke of humbled Muslims bowing down to the victorious flag of the United States. Imagine standing up in front of a ball game and singing that one. A little politically incorrect. Or that the original Statue of Liberty showed a veiled Arab woman holding a torch. They'd be surprised because, frankly, once upon a time, I would have been surprised. Once upon a time, I think as many Americans do think even to this day, that America's involvement in the Middle East began sometime in the aftermath of World War II. With the advent of the Arab-Israeli conflict, America's deepening dependence on Middle Eastern sources of oil, the coming of the Cold War to the Middle East. And I say I believe this too because once upon a time I was a graduate student in this country. And then one day, I was listening to a lecture on the emergence of modern Egypt in the 19th century, and my professor mentioned parenthetically that in the late 1860s, William Tecumseh Sherman, General Sherman, the chief of the U.S. Army, sent a group of Civil War veterans, former Confederate and Union officers, to Egypt to help modernize the Egyptian army. And they get to Egypt, and the Civil War veterans discover to their chagrin that most of the Egyptian army is illiterate. They can't read the manuals that these Americans have brought. So they begin to set up schools to teach literacy to Egyptian soldiers. And the next day, the Egyptian soldiers showed up with their children. And so these veterans of Vicksburg and Gettysburg got into the business of teaching literacy to Egyptian school children. And while they were at it, they said to themselves, well, why don't we impart to these Egyptians some American ideas? And what ideas did they impart? They imparted patriotism, civic virtues, as it was called back then, and democracy. Americans teaching democracy in the Middle East in the 1860s. So I'm in graduate school and I'm listening to this lecture and I'm thinking, wow, that is really interesting. So as soon as the lecture was over, I ran out to the library to read more about these officers' experience, and I found nothing. Very frustrating. I found that there were many books about Britain in the Middle East, many books about France in the Middle East, but no book about America in the Middle East. Certainly no book that would place these Civil War veterans' extraordinary experience in Egypt in the 1860s within any meaningful historical context. Flash forward some years to the aftermath of 9/11. Suddenly, Americans are being asked to make some very fateful decisions about their future in the Middle East, decisions that will impact not only their well-being, but the security of much of the world. And suddenly, the absence of an historical context in which to make these decisions becomes glaringly apparent. And so one evening while I'm sitting with my good friend and editor at a restaurant in New York, and he leans across the table and he says, okay, Michael, what is the one book about the modern Middle East that has not been written, but which must be written? And I didn't hesitate a nanosecond. I told him, America in the Middle East. And that's where my problems began. As you heard from Professor Hecht, my previous book was about the Six-Day War, 1967. Close to 400 pages I wrote about 6 days of history. Suddenly, I was contracting to write about 230 years of history and a rich, diverse, complex legacy of American involvement in the Middle East. How, in Lord's name, was I going to get a handle on this mass of information? And it occurred to me very early on that the only way to cope with this massive legacy was to identify the underlying themes which bound together the complex narrative. And the first theme I identified would be the first theme I imagine you would identify as well, and that's the theme of power. And by power, we mean the defense, protection of America's vital interests in the Middle East to the application of power, sometimes military power, but not exclusively. There can be diplomatic power, economic power. Power certainly described the situation that obtained between the United States and the Barbary pirates of the Middle East in the 1780s. In the spring of 1787, about 127 American sailors had been captured and enslaved by the Barbary pirates. America was facing its first hostage crisis in the Middle East. Imagine if 127 Americans were taken hostage today. And again, America had no means of securing their liberation because it didn't have a navy. And so in May 1787, when representatives of the states convened in Philadelphia to discuss the possibility of replacing the Articles of Confederation with a permanent constitution, the Barbary pirates crisis loomed very large indeed. And if you were to go into the ratification debate surrounding the Constitution, if you were to go to the debates in New England, which had extensive maritime interests in the Middle East, you would find representatives to the Constitutional Convention standing up and saying, well, if we don't have a constitution, we can't have a central government. If we don't have a central government, we can't have a navy. And if we don't have a navy, the Barbary pirates are going to kill our commerce and we'll die as a nation. But if you were to travel further south, you travel to Georgia, to the Carolinas, you'd see representatives of the Constitutional Convention standing up and saying, if we don't have a constitution, we can't have a central government. If we don't have a central government, we can't have a navy. And if we don't have a navy, we're going to have Algerines, as they were called back then, Algerines landing on the shores of Georgia and enslaving our sons and daughters, and we'll die as a nation. And so by marshaling a mortal threat from the Middle East, the pro-federalist forces in the United States were able to promulgate a constitution in 1789. And 5 years later, Congress passes into law a bill signed by President George Washington allocating $688,442.23 for the creation of the U.S. Navy. And that bill says that this Navy is being constructed specifically to fight in the Middle East. And America goes to war. The Barbary Wars, America's first foreign military engagement, the first American servicemen killed overseas or killed in the Middle East. And it's America's longest foreign engagement. It lasts roughly from the 1780s, and with many, many setbacks before America begins to register some successes. It's not till 1805 that a group of U.S. Marines lead a band of mercenaries 500 miles across the Libyan desert to attack Tripoli from behind. That's the line to the shores of Tripoli in the Marine anthem. Probably heard it. And it's not till 1815 that Stephen Decatur, for whom about 27 towns and cities are named in this country, sails a U.S. fleet into Tripoli and Algiers harbor, and he vanquishes the pirates at Cannon Point. And so America learns some of its first lessons in power from the Middle East. A mortal threat from this region impels these 13 disparate states to coalesce into a United States, a singular as opposed to a plural noun, a United States. It forces these states to produce power for the first time in the form of a navy and to project that power for the first time thousands of miles from America's shores. And in creating a navy not to rule the waves, but to free the waves, the United States opens up the sea lanes for to the Middle East for the agents of American faith. Faith being the second great theme that binds together the disparate narrative. Faith in the American context is a huge component, but a very complex one at the same time. It has two sides. It has a civic and secular side. This is the faith of a Puritan American going back to the 17th century, and the Puritans want to create a country which is going to be a city on a hill. Uniquely, there's really no country in the world like it because it comes into existence not only to ensure the liberty of its own citizens, but the freedom of all of mankind. It's going to be a beacon of freedom for the entire planet. But faith has a flip side in the American context, and that is a purely religious faith, a no less missionary, zealous faith. It's the faith of a Protestant Christian America, a Puritan America. Who were the Puritans? The Puritans were a dissenting Protestant sect which had suffered terribly at the hands of the official Church of England. And in an attempt to cope with their persecution in England, the Puritans looked back into their Bible for a model, and they looked back into the New Testament, and they didn't find it there. So they looked further back into those books of the Bible that had been systematically downplayed by Christianity for about 1,600 years. They looked back into what they called the Old Testament, and there the Puritans found something remarkable. They found a God who spoke directly to his people in their language, and he promised them something. He promised to rescue them from exile, to restore them to their promised land. And the Puritans read this story, and they loved this story. They embraced the story. They became the new Israel, the new Jews. England became the new Egypt. And they escaped from that England/Egypt, and they crossed the expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, which they likened to the Sinai, and they landed in the new world, which they called the New Promised Land. And they immediately imposed the map of the old Promised Land on the New Promised Land, which is why if you're on the other shore of this country, on the East Coast, you've got about 1,000 place and city names that are biblical Hebrew names. You've got your Bethlehems and your Bethels and your Jerichos. And if you're in Connecticut like I am now, you've got your New Canaans down the road. And they made Hebrew a mandatory language at all of their universities. James Madison was a Hebrew major at Princeton. He failed. He had to spend an extra year at Princeton. He couldn't get through Hebrew. They put Hebrew in the logo of Columbia and Dartmouth. Every day, I'm teaching at Yale this semester. Every day I walk into the Yale campus, there's a big Hebrew logo over my head, put there by President Ezra Stiles in 1770 because he was a great Hebraist. He spoke fluent Hebrew. They gave their kids biblical Hebrew names, David and Isaac and Benjamin and Sarah and Rebecca. So deeply identified were the Puritans and their descendants, the founding fathers, with this biblical Hebrew narrative that at the conclusion of the American Revolution in 1783, there was a debate among American leaders over what was going to be the great symbol of this nascent American state. And certain groups of American leaders thought that the symbol of the state should be the American bald eagle, clutching 13 arrows in its talon, one for each state. You may be familiar with that great seal. But there was another group of prominent Americans that said, no, the seal of the United States should show Moses leading the children of Israel out of bondage into the Promised Land. And there was a hotly contested debate in Congress over what was going to be the Great Seal of the United States. America had come this close to having Moses as its national symbol. Lost out, Dan. The designers of the Moses leading the children of Israel into salvation, designer of that seal, were Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. That's how closely identified they were with that story. Now, for many Puritans and their descendants through the Founding Father generation, the fact that the Americans conceived themselves as the new Jews meant that they had a certain kinship with the old Jews. And it also meant that they had a strong attachment to the old Promised Land, then known as Palestine, part of the Ottoman Empire. And they concluded that to be good Christians, to be good Americans, it was their divinely ordained duty to assist God in fulfilling his biblical promises to those old Jews, that is, to rescue them from exile, restore them to their promised land, and thus was born the notion of restorationism. Restorationism, an immensely pervasive idea in early America. You have Elias Boudinot, the first president of the Continental Congress, writes a book in which he predicts that when the Jews return to Palestine and reestablish their state there, they'll make the desert bloom like a rose. Some of you may think that David Ben-Gurion said that first. No, it was Elias Boudinot, president of the Continental Congress. John Adams, second president of the United States, said it was his most ardent wish that 100,000 Jewish soldiers, as well disciplined as the French army, that is the French army back then, would march back into Palestine and reclaim it as a Judean kingdom. You had Abraham Lincoln in 1863 saying that restoring the Jews to their ancient homeland was a dream that was cherished by a great many Americans, and he, Lincoln, would personally see to fulfilling that dream once America had restored its own unity in the Civil War. Perhaps the greatest single expression of this restorationist idea appears in a book published in 1844 called Visions of the Valley, a big, thick, gray book that calls on the U.S. government to send the U.S. Navy back to the Middle East to detach Palestine from the Ottoman Empire to give it to the Jews as a state. And this book, Visions of the Valley, becomes an antebellum bestseller. It sells 1 million copies. And the author of Visions of the Valley is a professor who is the chairman of the Hebrew language department at New York University, and his name is Professor George Bush. And 2 days in the genealogy department of the Library of Congress enabled me to ascertain that Professor George Bush, the author of Visions of the Valley, 1844, is a forebear of 2 later American presidents of the same name. Now, for some American Christians, this notion of dreaming about the Jewish state, visioning the Jewish state was insufficient. Some American Christians thought it was their divinely enjoined duty to go off to Palestine to help physically recreate this state. And beginning in the 1830s, groups of American Christians move to Palestine to help do this, particularly a great number of American women, Clorinda Minor of Philadelphia, Harriet Livermore of Washington. They leave in the 1830s, and they go off to Palestine to create American colonies there. And all of these colonies had the same remarkable goal. They all aspired to teach the Jews how to farm. These American Christians were also good Jeffersonians. Now, Jefferson believed that the basis of any viable modern state was an agrarian economy. The Jews had been exiled for 2,000 years. They'd forgotten how to farm. Therefore, these Americans thought it was their duty to reacquaint the Jews with agrarian life so that they could establish their state. And so they came to Palestine, they set up their colonies, and what to do about it? The Jews did not want to learn how to farm. Not from them, in any case. And these colonies suffered terribly. They suffered from starvation and exposure, attack by Bedouin bandits, but still they came. In 1855, Philip Dixon, a gentleman from Groton, Massachusetts, moved to Palestine with his wife and twin daughters. You heard from Professor Heck that the twin daughters married 2 German Lutheran brothers named Johann and Frederick Groß-Steinbeck. And together with the Groß-Steinbecks, the Dixons set up a farm on a place they called rather optimistically Mount Hope. And as it turned out, the Jews did not want to learn how to farm for the Dixons and the Groß-Steinbecks, and that farm was attacked again and again by Bedouin bandits. But still, waves of these American Christians came. In 1867, George Adams, a gentleman from Indian River, Maine, picks up from Indian River with 156 of his followers, artisans, merchants. They all move to Palestine, to another hillside outside of Jaffa, and they try to teach the Jews how to farm. The Jews don't want to learn how to farm, and the members of the Adams family contract a plague, and they die by the dozens. But the failure of these colonies did nothing at all to discourage the restorationist movement in America. On the contrary, that movement just soared. And it also gave birth to another wave of American immigrants to the Middle East, and immigrants that would ultimately alter the political future and map of the Middle East profoundly, and those were the American missionaries. On October 30th, 1818, two of America's first missionaries to the Middle East, Pliny Fisk and Levi Parsons, gave a parting sermon at Old South Church in Boston. You remember Old South Church from Paul Revere. Church was packed. Parsons and Fisk get up in front of this congregation. They say that they are going to the Middle East to ingather the Jews into Palestine so the Jews can recreate their Jewish state. Once the Jews have recreated their Jewish state, then the Jews will convert en masse to Congregationalist Protestantism. Failing that, Fisk and Parsons want to convert the Arab Muslims to Christianity. So Fisk and Parsons go off to the Middle East. They quickly find out that the Jews of the Middle East do not want to ingather under their auspices, do not want to become Congregationalists. They find further that if they try to convert the Muslim Arabs, they'll lose their heads because proselytizing under Ottoman law is a capital offense. So with a certain frustration, Fisk and Parsons turn to creating schools. And they create the first modern American-style elementary and secondary schools in what is today Syria and Palestine. And by the 1860s, successive waves of missionaries from the United States are creating the first modern universities in the region, what will later become the American University of Cairo, the American University of Beirut. And it is in these institutions that the missionaries and their descendants flip to the other civic side of American faith. They cease teaching what they call the gospel of Christianity and start teaching a gospel of Americanism, patriotism, civic virtues, and democracy. And the missionaries and their descendants get intimately involved in promoting a completely new identity in the Middle East, a secular nationalist identity, Arab nationalism, Turkish nationalism, that in which not only Muslims but Christians and even Jews can participate. And they become active in promoting the independence of Arabic-speaking peoples, first from Ottoman rule, and then after World War I from European colonial rule. And to the degree that in the post-World War I period, the goals of Arab nationalism, creating an Arab state in Palestine, become incompatible with the goals of creating a Jewish state in Palestine, and that goal is already being subsumed under its modern name of Zionism, then you have the two descendants of the same missionary restorationist movement clashing with one another. And that clash goes on to this day. If were you to read Jimmy Carter's recent book, here you have a person who comes out of a religious background, is approaching the Middle East as a religious Christian, and has great problems with the state of Israel and many of its policies. I believe he also has a theological problem with the state of Israel. And he is clashing with evangelical Christians in this country who remain some of Israel's biggest promoters here. But what's interesting for me as an historian is that whether it's Jimmy Carter's version or the evangelical version, they both come out of the same faith-based approach to America's involvement in the Middle East. And finally, we come to the third, most elusive, controversial of these themes, and that's the theme of fantasy. And you know this theme. This is the theme of the highly exoticized, romanticized, eroticized image of the Middle East. It's the image of the Middle East in which there are carpets orbiting minarets and genies emanating out of bottles and lamps and veiled but available harem girls. A lot of harem girls in this. It is the highly sexualized myths of the Middle East that inspire America's first explorer to the region to leave for Egypt in 1788. His name, John Ledyard. Extraordinary man, a Dartmouth dropout. He lived with the Iroquois for 10 years. He sailed around the world with Captain Cook, had probably seen more to the planet than any other American alive of his day, and he was a good friend of Thomas Jefferson's. And through Ledyard's correspondence with Jefferson, we today get a window into what the Middle East looked like to an American in 1788, and it doesn't look very good. Ledyard arrives in Egypt, and he is just crestfallen. The Middle East bears no resemblance to these myths. Instead of flying carpets and available harem girls, he finds poverty, backwardness, filth, and he has nothing good to report to Jefferson about the Middle East. It's just a devastating portrait, with one exception. Ledyard looks out into the desert, and he sees Bedouin. He sees nomads on their camels, on their horses, and he says to himself, well, these people are pretty much like our frontiersmen in western Pennsylvania and Ohio. Insofar as, like our frontiersmen, these nomads love liberty. They hate being fettered by government, and unfortunately, these particular nomads are languishing under an Ottoman tyranny. But Ledyard speculates that if some Western power were to come along and remove that tyranny, then these liberty-loving nomads of the desert would rise up and embrace American-style democracy. Sound familiar? 1788. Many of America's myths about the Middle East can be traced back to one book. It was the second most popular book on the American colonial bookshelf after the Bible. Though you didn't keep it alongside the Bible, you hid it behind the pewter dishes, because the book, even by 21st century standards, is pretty pornographic. It's called 1001 Arabian Nights. It's actually a collection of medieval Persian tales, some of them quite ribald, but you know the more popular ones. You know Aladdin, you know Sinbad the Sailor, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, Scheherazade storytelling for her life. Americans in the 18th century, early 19th century, they had no first-hand information about the Middle East, not as if they could pick up a newspaper. And they read 1001 Nights, and they thought that this is what the Middle East really looked like. And some of them were so aroused by these stories that they picked up from the United States, and they went to the Middle East not as soldiers, not as missionaries, but they went as tourists. First hundreds, then thousands. By the middle of the 19th centuries, the Americans have surpassed the British as the greatest single number of tourists in the Middle East. You have all these postcards home from English travelers complaining about how the brash Americans have snatched up all the good hotel rooms in Damascus. One of the American tourists who set off for the Middle East is a novelist whose previous book, Moby Dick, only sold 3,000 copies. And he was depressed, and he was looking for some inspiration for a new travel novel. And so in 1855, Herman Melville packed two shirts and a toothbrush, and he went off to the Middle East. And he keeps a very detailed diary, and if you have a chance, read the thing. It's this thick, but it's amazing. It's postmodern and borderline hallucinogenic. Read it. And Herman Melville actually travels to the Middle East with 1001 Nights under his arm, and he, too, is just despondent. The Middle East bears no resemblance to what he's read about in the 1001 Nights, the terrible portrait of the Middle East in his diary. And yet, waves of American tourists keep on coming. 12 years later, another aspiring American writer boards a steamship in Philadelphia called the Quaker City. He's got a contract from 2 American newspapers to publish his collected dispatches from the Middle East, and he will publish them under the title Innocents Abroad. And his name is Samuel Clemens, but he'll use for Innocents Abroad for the first time his pen name of Mark Twain. And the Middle East is going to make Mark Twain. Innocents Abroad becomes the biggest selling work of nonfiction in the second half of the 19th century in the United States. It makes Mark Twain a very wealthy man. And what's the remarkable thing is that there's nothing remotely complimentary about the Middle East in this book. Just a devastating portrait of the Middle East. Twain is unique in that he has nothing to say even nice about the Americans in the Middle East. He depicts the Americans running around with sledgehammers and knocking off pieces of pyramids to take home as souvenirs. American vandals, he calls them. The name sticks. But still, waves of these Americans come, thousands and thousands, and by the early 20th century, Middle Eastern myths, particularly that myth of a black-clad Middle Eastern nomad sweeping out of the desert on his steed and snatching up some innocent Western damsel and taking her back to the oasis to have his way with her, that myth, you've seen it, that myth becomes appropriated by the burgeoning Hollywood industry. And some of Hollywood's first blockbuster films are those Middle Eastern fantasies. 1927, The Sheikh of Araby, that propels Rudolph Valentino to stardom. There he is, that sheikh with the black veil, sweeping out of the desert and taking up some innocent Western damsel. And the 1927 hit song of the same name, on the Sheikh of Araby, my heart belongs to thee. At night when you're asleep, into your tent I creep. There you have it. Those of us of a certain generation, I'm looking down at you guys, remember 1974 Maria Muldaur's song, Midnight at the Oasis? It's the same lyrics, just it's the woman singing to the man, come into my tent, make your night. Middle Eastern fantasies. And Hollywood goes on to produce just dozens and dozens of Middle Eastern fantasy movies. I'm teaching this course, America and the Middle East at Yale, and every single lecture I start with a Middle Eastern fantasy movie. And I actually have far more movies than I have lectures. And by the 1970s, Hollywood is turning out Indiana Jones, and it's turning out the Hidalgos, and finally the Saharas, if you're unfortunate enough to have seen that. And they're all Middle Eastern fantasy movies. And Middle Eastern fantasy become so deeply ingrained in the American imagination that I imagine that even on September 11th, 2001, there was a significant portion of the American public who were really nonplussed to see that people from these rather romantic oases, these baroque figures, left their camels, left their palm trees to come to the United States to hijack airliners and crash them into large buildings in New York and into the Pentagon. Power, faith, and fantasy. These were the three themes that I identified that bound together the long 230-year narrative of American involvement in the Middle East. Sometimes these themes can exist independent of one another. The Barbary pirates issue, the missionaries, John Ledyard. But more often than not, power, faith, and fantasy are involved in some type of dynamic intertwining with one another, often in opposition to one another. For example, faith meets up with fantasy in 1856, December, when Herman Melville visits this Dixon Gross-Steinbeck colony outside of Jaffa. And Melville writes about the colony in his diary, and he writes about the poverty, he writes about the cold and the mud, and just how depressing the place is. And he leaves in deeper depression. And a month later, that Dixon colony is attacked again by Bedouin bandits. And this time they break into the compound, and they knock Philip Dixon on the head mortally. He's actually buried in the Protestant cemetery across from me, from where I live in Jerusalem. And they rape brutally his wife and two daughters. Frederick Gross-Steinbeck is shot in the groin and dies an agonizing death. And the only one to escape unscathed from this attack is Johann Gross-Steinbeck, who, according to consular records, at this point leaves Palestine, moves to California, right near here, near Sacramento, right? Not near here, but in global terms, moves to Sacramento and Americanizes his name. Melville goes home, and he writes a 26,000-line poem called Clarel, which I don't recommend. But in the poem Clarel, there is a description of the attack and rape of the Dixon Gross-Steinbeck farm. But again, as you heard from Professor Hecht earlier, there's another portrayal of that horrible event in another greater literary work, the novel East of Eden, an epic biblical novel written by Johann Gross-Steinbeck's grandson, John Steinbeck III. But the point is that here, John Steinbeck's grandfather has lunch with Herman Melville in 1856 on an American colony in Palestine dedicated to recreating the Jewish state. Faith meets up with fantasy. Faith met fantasy again in 1867 when the Quaker city carrying the soon-to-be famous Mark Twain helped evacuate the 47 survivors of the George Adams colony from the beaches of Jaffa. And perhaps the only non-caustic paragraph in Innocents Abroad is the one in which Mark Twain describes the plight of these Americans who have come from Indian River, Maine to Palestine to help recreate Jewish sovereignty there. Again, faith meeting fantasy. Power meets up with faith. In 1903, when Theodore Roosevelt sends the U.S. Navy into Beirut Harbor to threaten the Ottoman authorities there, whom he claims are mistreating the missionaries in the city. Faith would trump power in 1917 when America entered World War I. Again, a little world history. America declares war against the Central Powers, against Germany, Austria, Hungary in April 1917. But there's a third Central Power, and that's the Turks. And the British are fighting against the Turks. The French are fighting against the Turks. The question is, will America go to war in the Middle East? And there was strong support in both houses of Congress for a declaration of war against Istanbul, but the president hesitated. The president, Woodrow Wilson, was the grandson, son, and nephew of Presbyterian ministers, and he was very close to the American missionaries in the Middle East. And the missionaries came to him and said, Mr. President, if you go to war against the Turks are going to do to our missionaries what they're doing to the Armenians. They're massacring them. And Woodrow Wilson decided not to go to war in the Middle East, perhaps the single most fateful decision ever taken by an American president in the Middle East. Because as a result of that decision, at the end of World War I, there are 1 million British soldiers in the Middle East and 100,000 French soldiers in the Middle East, but there's not one American soldier anywhere in the Middle East. And guess which countries got to draw the post-World War I map of the Middle East? Not the United States. Faith triumphed over power finally in 1948. In 1948, after the UN had voted to partition Palestine into an independent Arab and an independent Jewish state. The Jewish state was set to come into being on May 14th, 1948. On May 12th, there's a meeting in the Oval Office between the Secretary of State, George Marshall, and the President. Marshall, the most influential, revered American of his generation, says to the President that we are encountering an unparalleled event in the history of American foreign policy making because every element of that foreign policy-making establishment in Washington, the State Department, the Defense Department, the Pentagon, agree with no dissenting opinion that if America recognizes this newly created Jewish state, a global catastrophe will ensue. The Arabs will cut off the oil to Western Europe. That Europe will fall to the communists. And worst of all, the American armed forces are going to have to go into Palestine to defend the Jews there from a certain massacre by the Arabs. And then George Marshall adds a little kicker. He says, Mr. President, if you recognize the Jewish state, I, George Marshall, will not vote for you in the 1948 presidential elections. Imagine Condi saying that today. Amazing. President is Harry Truman. Truman, who had been raised a strict Baptist, who had claimed to memorize the Bible by age 14, had been a member of a restorationist group called the American Christian Committee for Palestine, had a Jewish best friend named Eddie Jacobson. Truman listened to Marshall's arguments, and he said nothing. We have the protocol of the discussion. He said, thank you. And he proceeded to lock himself into the White House for the next 48 hours. He was an avid diarist. He wrote nothing in his diary for the next 48 hours. We don't know what went through his head. All we know is that at 6:11 Washington time, May 14th, 11 minutes after Israel declared its independence, Harry Truman made the United States the first nation on earth to recognize the recreated Jewish state. Now, why would he do such a thing? Why would any president in history go against the advice of his most senior counselor and risk what the senior counselor was calling global catastrophe? Well, the fact of the matter is we don't know because Truman wrote nothing in his diary. All we know is that several weeks later there was a delegation of dignitaries visiting the White House, and they're going through the hallway, and they run smack into Harry Truman. And Harry Truman is introduced to this delegation as the president who helped create the State of Israel, and Truman gets insulted. Helped create the State of Israel, he says? Helped create the State of Israel? I'm Cyrus, he says. I'm Cyrus. Hey, someone knows their Bible. I can always find the Bible notes. Cyrus, of course, being the great Persian king, the ancient Persian king who rescued the Jews from exile and restored them to their promised land. I'm Cyrus. 1948 is the great watershed year in American involvement in the year. It's, of course, the year that America becomes involved in the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's the year where the Cold War comes to the Middle East. It's the year where America really becomes dependent on Middle Eastern sources of oil. It's the year, I think, most significantly, in which America begins to replace Britain and France as the preeminent Western power in the Middle East, and so becomes the heir to about 1,000 years of antagonism between the Middle East and the West. And from that point on, American leaders have to labor, struggle to try to reconcile these countervailing impulses of power, faith, and fantasy, and guess what? They don't succeed very much. What you see is a tremendous amount of zigzagging in American policy toward the Middle East. You have 1953, the Eisenhower administration binding together with Great Britain to oust a popular Iranian prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, who the British and the Americans suspected was getting a little bit too close to the Soviets in the Cold War. But 3 years later, you have the same Eisenhower administration going against Britain, going against France in the Suez Crisis to save another Middle Eastern nationalist leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, who had gotten very close to the Soviets in the Cold War. Go figure. You have American soldiers going into active combat against the forces of Iran, Libya, and Syria. But it's very often forgotten, not just in the Middle East, but here in the United States, that America played an instrumental role in securing the independence of Iran, Syria, and Libya. American presidents, very supportive of the state of Israel, but at crucial junctures in Israel history, American leaders have imposed arms embargoes on the Jewish state. They have pressured Israeli leaders to relinquish territories in the search for peace, but some Israeli leaders thought those territories were vital for Israel's security. Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, this is my favorite zigzag. Ronald Reagan in the 1980s builds up Saddam Hussein as a counterbalance to the Iranians, and then turns around and sells the Iranians sophisticated missiles in an attempt to induce them to take fewer American hostages in Lebanon. Got that? Basically violating Thomas Jefferson's first rule in the Barbary Pirates. The more you pay off the pirates, the more piracy you get. Guess what we got? We got more piracy. You have Americans since 1979, since the Iranian Revolution, American armed forces have been engaged almost uninterruptedly in military operations somewhere in the Middle East. We're approaching a 30-year war between the United States and the Middle East. And those of us of a certain generation, again, have lived to see how the uniforms worn by American servicewomen and men have burnished from a bright Vietnamese green in the 1970s and 80s to a tawny Arabian brown today. Our soldiers actually wear the colors of the Middle East, wherever they are. It's amazing. And then, in the spring of 2003, America invaded Iraq. And for one glimmering moment, it all seemed to come together. There were the purveyors of American power, American armed forces, patrolling Baghdad, the fabled city of 1001 Nights, and they were there imparting American ideas of democracy to a population that appeared then to be desperate to rise up and embrace those ideas. And that moment has, rather tragically, fleetingly passed. Today, American policymakers are going to have to work immensely, gargantuanly, to try to reconcile the pursuit and defense of America's vital interest in the Middle East while upholding their fundamental beliefs as Americans, all the while distinguishing between myth and reality in the Middle East. It is truly a towering task. America will have to continue to project power in this region. Iraq, the Middle East, is not Vietnam. In 1975, America could pull out of Vietnam and be pretty confident that the North Vietnamese were not going to march down the center street of Santa Barbara. Not the case with the Middle East. You can pull out of Iraq tomorrow, but you cannot disengage from the Middle East because the Middle East is not going to detach from you. And America is going to have to continue to project power, but it's going to have to learn that the power cannot achieve all of America's aims in the Middle East. Power has its limits, and America is going to have to learn to project power prudently and efficaciously, wisely in the Middle East. Upholding American beliefs is absolutely essential. We've seen the pitfalls of America failing to uphold those beliefs in incidents such as Abu Ghraib. But we also have to understand that American ideas of liberty, American ideas of democracy are not necessarily consonant with those ideas in the Middle East. And not all American definitions of democracy and freedom are translatable, transplantable to the Middle East. And finally, distinguishing myth from reality, that is the hardest task faced by Americans. It's the task of asking some difficult questions, whether the United States has to remain in Iraq for 1 year or 2 years or 20 or 30 years, facing up to that reality. On the Israeli-Palestinian peace track, asking the question whether there's any Israeli government that can remove 100,000 Israeli settlers from the West Bank, because that would be the minimal price for creating a Palestinian state there, or whether there's a Palestinian leadership that's capable of cleaning up the corruption in the West Bank, capable of clamping down on terror, capable of truly accepting a permanent and legitimate Jewish state along its borders. Huge questions. And then finally, the hardest task of separating myth from reality. What are the ramifications, not just for the Middle East, but for all Americans as well, of a nuclear Iran? That is a huge question. And here is the really bad news. There are no answers in my book. There are no answers in my book. I always say, as an historian, I have enough problems predicting the past. But the book wasn't designed to give answers. The book was designed to help pose and frame the questions. First of all, the book was designed to share my fascination with this extraordinary 230-year legacy of American involvement in the Middle East. And as you've heard today, it's not a legacy, not merely of military confrontation, but above all, It is a heritage of cooperation in the fields of healthcare and education, in the arts, in literature. That is this legacy, just ineffably rich. But also, and far more importantly, the purpose of the book was to create a context of the past in which Americans who will still be pressed to make decisions fateful to their own future and the future of the world, a context of the past in which we can begin to chart our future. Thank you all.